Welcome to the, I think this is the first of the student presentations in this term for the IRES seminar series. In fact, maybe student presentations is the wrong word here because one of our presenters is a recent graduate, Helina Jolie, just defended her thesis a couple of weeks back and is now a research associate with IBIOS, which I think stands for Interdisciplinary Biodiversity Solutions. Yes. Helina, and you'll see her work in her presentation, but did this fantastic thesis examining how cartoon icons, a group that lives, indigenous group that lives in the forests of the Wayanad district in Kerala, view forests, their relationship with wildlife, their how they think of fire and its role in forests, and the role that the Indian state has played in subjugating them. I mean, it's actually a fantastic piece of interdisciplinary research, and I'll you know, I'm sure you'll get to hear of it in the next half an hour. But she's also done a movie based on that field work as part of her tenure as a National Geographic explorer. So the movie is called Giriki Wapatu. I'm not sure I got the Malayalam right there, Helina. I urge you to go and watch it. I imagine, Helina, you can put the link in the chat. Helina is a consummate interdisciplinary researcher. She got an undergraduate in zoology. She got environmental policy masters from the London School of Economics. She worked in India in NGOs and research organizations at the intersection of development and the environment. And then she got a PhD with us. Now she's working with IBIOS. So that's a fantastic arc of a career. Helina, over to you.
Thanks, Milind. Thank you for such kind words and such a wonderful introduction. Before I begin, I would like to thank Terry and Milind. Terry and Milind both supervised my thesis. So yeah, everything I'm presenting here also is part of how much they mentored and helped me and guided me and supported me. And here is the link to the documentary that I made as part of my thesis. If anybody is interested, please feel free to watch it. And my voice is really bad. I'm recovering from the Omicron. So in case you're not able to hear me properly, just let me know in case I break my voice in between or something. So if it's okay, shall I start? Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your time. Today, I'm going to give a presentation on reimagining conservation landscapes, Adivasi characterization of human dimensions of southern Indian forest, where I will briefly discuss my PhD research work and some of its key findings. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I speak from the traditional ancestral unceded territory of Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the lands and the people whose knowledge I will be sharing today in this presentation. I want to start this presentation with a question. What are two things far too common to policies that support displacement of indigenous people from ancestral lands? One, poor characterization of indigenous forest relations. As observed during the indigenous protest of land rights across the world, like Dongria Kon people of India against Vedanta Mining Company, Baka people of South Cameroon against conversion of ancestral land to safari reserves, Brazilian Guarani against displacement due to ranching and farming. Two, continued reliance on forest and wildlife management policies steeped in colonial legacies. Several post-colonial countries continue to adopt the colonial conservation practices, such as creation of protected area by removal of tribal people. Both these points are true for Adivasis of India. With more than 700 ethnic groups and 106 million members, Adivasis are the largest indigenous population in the world. Most of them live around some of the most biodiverse and mineral-rich areas of India, yet they remain as some of the poorest of the poor in Indian society. Often regarded as uncultured, primitive, trespassers, and criminals by mainstream society, Adivasi understanding of forest is treated as knowledge that needs correction, and it has scant representation in policies of India. After independence, India continued to follow many colonial policies that legitimized displacement of Adivasis. For nearly 60 years, there was no legal recognition of Adivasi association with forest. In 2006, Forest Rights Act was introduced to reconcile the historical injustice experienced by Adivasi people. While India is signatory to United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, it has not yet conferred Adivasis with self-determination and land access rights. Hence, a large majority of Adivasis continue to remain dispossessed, unrecognized, and landless, and the Indian forest landscapes remain without their original people. The study reported here is derived from my fieldwork in Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary, a protected area in the Wayanad district of Kerala in India. Wayanad lies within the global biodiversity hotspot of Western Ghats. It has a large Adivasi population that historically endured oppression and subjugation. In 1973, Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary was established by the Government of India to uphold forest and wildlife policies. Like many other protected areas in India, it has also systemically overlooked Adivasis, who had a long-standing association with land. Several Adivasi people were forcefully moved from their ancestral land, and these displacements in Wayanad particularly affected the forest-dwelling Kartanaikan people. Kartanaikans are one of the last surviving hunter-foragers of Indian subcontinent. Characterized by their animistic belief system, deep-rooted relationship with forests, and excellent knowledge of honeybees, they call themselves the leaders of the forest. The overall objective of this thesis is to understand Kartanaikan people, their relationship with forests, by characterizing the fundamentals of their coexistence with wild animals, landscapes, forest fire, and biocultural food system. As described by a Kartanaikan member during the field visit, Adivasi life is hinged on these four components, the four legs of a table. If one of them falls, Adivasi falls too. In the study, I used a combination of qualitative ethnographic research methods such as participatory observation, open-ended and semi-structured interviews, transect walk, and GIS mapping. Transect walk inside the protected areas involved walking with community members, visiting and mapping culturally important places. All these methods together provided a multisensory experience of the research area and context. Data collected in Malayalam language was translated, transcribed, and coded. I used an inductive coding using NVivo software with proper validity and reliability check during and after the analysis. All this led to the 4 empirical chapters of this thesis and the ethnographic documentary Giduguwab. In the first empirical piece, we discussed human-wildlife relations. As human-wildlife habitats increasingly overlap, many interactions turn into conflict. Since the frontier ways of separating humans and nature do not offer long-term solutions, there is a growing need to integrate concepts such as coexistence tolerance in wildlife management approaches. With this motivation, in this chapter, we explored Kartanaikan people and their relationship with wildlife and how they characterized it. By we, I mean to include my collaborators, from Adivasi members, field support staff to my supervisors. We found that Kartanaikans perceived human-wildlife interactions through deep coexistence, characterized by their understanding of wild animals as rational conversing beings, gods, teachers, and equals, relatives with shared origin practicing dharma. We found that deep coexistence, by positioning animals as rational conversing personalities, questions the centrality of humans in mediating human-wildlife interactions. It claims that animal perception of humans are equally important as human perception of animals. Animals are buddhiyulla jeevigal, intelligent beings. They will also do things that are based on Shari and Satyam. By seeing animals as individuals, deep coexistence is convivial, but also situates fear and conflict. It corresponds to their knowledge that if an elephant is involved in a conflict, doesn't make every elephant you meet in forest to behave in conflict pattern. Every person in the forest has a different nature. Some elephants are angry and some are not. Wild animals occupy a significant position in Kartanaikan socio-ecological order. Therefore, Kartnaikon relationship with wild animals involves respect, reverence, fear, acceptance. Deep coexistence perceived animals as part of forests, just like humans. As relatives with shared origin, community members drew similarity with animals and often socio-rationalized animal behaviors. We like wild animals in the forest more than humans outside the forest. We have been living with these animals for such a long time. We believe animals are also part of forests just like us. Deep coexistence recognizes that both animals and humans have limitations and strengths. Therefore, while everyone has right to forest resources, individuals also have the responsibility to recognize their fellow animals' limitations and share resources as dharma. Even if it's a dog, human, dog, or chicken, everyone should do their sacred duty, giving dharma. Whatever we eat, it should be shared with others. Deep coexistence between cartoon icons and animals is a mutual and respectful engagement agreed by both parties. It seeks no reward or incentive. So the practice of deep coexistence is bipartisan and intentional action between humans and animals. In the next chapter, we discuss how indigenous peoples' displacement from ancestral land is legitimized by poor representation of their relationship with forest. Even though they have a long-standing association with land, their rightful presence on it is often contested. With this motivation, we ask how cartoonic and spatial relations, practices, and encounters within the landscape facilitate their living in the protected area forest. We found that cartoonicans use the word Kardu to reference their ancestral forest land and characterized it as convergence of good places and God people, kinfolk with fluid identities and porous boundaries, a complete and all-encompassing entity with its own agency. A typical map of a protected area often show wildlife habitats and corridors. Through transect walk and GIS mapping, we found that 70 culturally important places inside the sanctuary. It included various landscape features like river, pond, wetland, hills as temples, burial sites, ancestral sites, etc. For example, this is Nalla Thanni, a culturally important site which offers cartoonic and water even in the driest summer. It is also a place where their gods reside. While a simple translation of the word Kadu in English is forest, but for community members, it is more of a complex idea of ecosystem. The word forest represented the concept of protected areas that elicited fear, prohibition, and separation. But the word Kadu signifies familiarity, belonging, safety, and security. Kadu is our home, and it is where our ancestors and gods live. We are scared of forests, meaning forest department. Often conservation landscapes are seen as topographic features, administrative borders, and wildlife habitats. We found that it also includes places that hold physical and metaphysical entities with properties and meaning that are not represented in conventional protected area map. These are our Nalla Sthalangal, where our gods reside. These are our Swandam, and since our ancestors' time. For community members, ancestral land fosters connection, relations, and networks between beings of different worlds, making it a multifaceted, living, and active landscape. A Kartanakan elder showed this during the transect walk, a Nalla Sthalam, good place, that has footprints of many beings in the forest, including those of humans. The idea of human-nature separation in Kartanakan cosmology is an absolute concept. They describe that relationship, encounters, and interactions in Kadu extends beyond the legal and physical boundaries of the protected areas. This contradicts the idea of protected area that wrongly assumes that processes and activities inside the natural world respect the socially constructed boundaries of authority. During the puja in Adivasi settlements, we beat drums, sing songs, and invite them from the forest to settlements. This is a picture of a cartoon icon dressed as a bear during a festival, inviting deceased ancestors from the forest to their settlement outside the protected area. Contrary to the idea of forest being a vulnerable, damaged element seeking protection, Kadu for community members is an all-encompassing agency with superior intelligence. Kadu provides Elam or everything, which constitutes identity, connection to ancestors, home to the non-human kins, medicines, and knowledge. We continue to depend on forests then and now. Kadu provides us with Ella. In the third empirical piece, we discuss human forest fire coexistence. Historically, Adivasis in India practiced the seasonal burning of fire that shaped the landscape and created an active association between humans and fire. Yet, perceived as a threat to wildlife and biodiversity, burning forest is legally banned, and putting fire in forest is a criminal offense. Constructive conversation on fire in environmental history of India are scant, and discourses on human-fire coexistence is nearly non-existent. Building on this, we examine the understanding of Adivasi way of knowing fire and learning about motivations and benefits that foster burning of the forest. We found that fire for Cartoonicans is a preserver and groomer of landscape identity, co-manager and actor of forest spaces, enabler of ecosystem functions and relations. It contrasted with the conventional narrations of the forest fire as a hazard and threat. We found that Cartoonicans, a well-cooked forest, supports an active and functional ecosystem. They described forest fire being equivalent to forest taking a bath. The fire increased visibility, hygiene, and food availability, a landscape of abundance. In contrast, a fire-suppressed forest meant a landscape of scarcity. Community members had knowledge and understanding of coexisting with fire. They described forest fire as an integral part of Wayanad landscape, having equal right to exist just like them. They think when Kadu it burns, it creates problem. But we have heard of stories of beautiful forest fires since our childhood. We knew fire from our childhood. It is part of the forest just like us. Positioned as a fellow being, fire is not seen as a chemical construct, but instead an ecosystem element, which is a byproduct of human-nature interactions and a subset of the natural history. This possibly explains their positive stance towards a fire. Forest fire is not a new phenomena in these landscapes. Animals are aware of it, so they often escape. It is not harming them. Like us, they are also prepared for fire every year. According to community members, a burnt forest with short grasses and scattered tree is the real identity of Wayanad forest. And this landscape identity influences their knowledge and relationship within it. And when it changes as a function of fire suppression, it directly affects the local people's fire-driven relationship with ecosystem. It felt so good walking through such open spaces. We can watch several animals while walking. Now it's not the same. By citing the shared history of oppression and pattern of subjugation, and community members often drew similarities with the forest fire. They attributed dispossession of Adivasis from fire as a reason for the disruption of the local ecosystem. The knowledge that fire can make decisions indicates that human-fire relationship is not a trivial affair for Cartoonicans. Fire knows its path, and it decides what will burn and what will survive. In the fourth study, we discussed Adivasi food transitions. With this motivation, we explored what are some of the characterization and worldviews that guide Cartoonican relationship with these foodways. We found that forest-based food for Cartoonicans meant communicator of preferences and inclination, keeper of memories and knowledge, custodian of identity and aspiration, facilitator of relations and reciprocities, and assessor of effort and nurture. Community members describe forest food as versatile, multifaceted, and plural identities. Sometimes we roast it or cook it as curry. Nyalli is important for our ceremonies. In our after-death ceremonies, we need a special nyalli from forest. We call it kotra nyalli. Food holds memories, emotions, and knowledge, and failure to reference these as fundamental features of Adivasi food system is a big disservice to these traditional foodways. Food engagement in forest is a respectful activity guided by permission seeking and sharing, unlike modern foodways, which is transaction often determined primarily by wealth. Both food and the animal must agree. Food agrees to get eaten, that is when the animal gets its food, after seeking permission. Cartoonicans engaged in limited resource competition and enforced sustainable harvesting practice. So hunger in Adivasi outlook is a collective challenge rather than an individual's failure. Back in the early days, our people did not go hungry. Food that we got from forests was shared with people. Community members in our study did not perceive forest as a place of absolute abundance. It rejects the idea of forest as a grocery store where people walk in and forage food effortlessly. Do you know how hard it is to get these tubers in the forest? Sometimes we dig the whole day. That much work, you know. What emerges from this thesis is an interpretation of forests that highlights coexistence over domination. This critically contrasts the ideologies of human nature associations upheld by Indian forest policies. We summarize some of the key insights here as positive stories on human-animal associations are a start, and distorted representation of these relations might be fear, encourage exclusionary conservation and displacement of vulnerable communities as failed experiments in coexistence. By acknowledging forests as collaborative and pluralistic, all-inclusive landscape, we recommend valuing all beings in their network and interactions that function in these conservation landscape, rather than taking a myopic approach of only wildlife protection. By understanding that all fires are not bad, we suggest that policies that make a blanket ban on forest fire reflect poor knowledge of traditional fire and is a direct violation on Adivasi rights and freedom. By recognizing that a comprehensive knowledge of Adivasi food waste is necessary to recognize human-forest relationship lost through food transitions, we argue these can inform inclusive food and forest management programs. Even while forest policies such as Forest Rights Act exist, in 2009, Supreme Court of India declared a forced eviction of undocumented Adivasis. Though the decision has been put on hold, it is a reminder that India's forest and wildlife policies remain rooted in British colonial legacy, excluding humans and nature, even as India approaches its 75th year as sovereign electoral democracy. The more I think about this dissertation, the more I see how much I have learned from Cartonic and people of fine art. I will continue to take these lessons to heart and hope to make them part of my research journey, regardless of where the path takes me. Thank you, everyone. I would like to give acknowledgements to the Cartonic and people of fine art, Kerala Tribal Authority, Kerala Forest Department, my supervisors Tere Satterfield and Milind Kantlikar, my committee member Janine Ramatullah, my field partner Suma, former scientist at MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, all the funding and grant agencies, my research assistants and field support people, teammates from Tere and Milind's lab, and my friends and family. Thank you.
We have a couple of minutes for questions. No questions?
Yes, sorry, I was raising my hand. Apologies if that was not visible.
Oh, sorry.
Helina, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. It was really, really interesting to hear about your experiences and the conclusions that you drew from your studies. I had a quick question, just because you made specific suggestions as to how the forest policies in particular could be more progressive. Have you engaged with the government at all on this, or have some of your partners taken to integrating some of your recommendations to move them forward?
Thanks, Colette. That's a really great question. And yeah, I did, part of my work did also get the permission from the Forest Department. And this particular work has not been done in that area yet. So this is one of the first time these studies are being done. So as I transition into my post PhD life, I definitely plan to share these findings with the Forest Department and also get their inputs on and their perspective on this particular, learnings and insights that I've gathered. So yeah, definitely that. Till now, I haven't shared, but yeah, I have had many discussions during my fieldwork with them, and also kind of shared with them that how these thoughts are evolving. So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Helina.
Any other questions for Helina? Maurizio?
Yep. Thank you, Milind. Let me just lower my hand. Thank you very much, Helina, and congratulations for your completing your project. And thank you for sharing your experiences and the beautiful pictures. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about maybe some of the external pressures and how they are perceived. Like, you know, you say like there's a different external mentality on how to manage the forest. Are there any internal conflicts in terms of how they might see some of the trade-offs? Like, oh, well, maybe we would be getting new access to new things, new services, or what are these kinds of external pressures for these communities? And is there like a general consensus of how they're viewed, or is there some sort of conflict about views on trade-offs that might be present from external management?
Thanks, Mauricio. That's a good question again. Yeah, it's really good. So if I'm trying to answer this question, so in India, all the forests which comes under the government, so the forest is mostly state managed. So either state province managed, and then there is the federal management. So, and the community members that I work particularly with, they live in the peripheral forest area, and some of them live within these protected area. And according to the law, people are not allowed to be inside the forest. So, you know, as a part of the forest management, you know, less human interaction inside the forest is considered as the best way of managing and protecting the wildlife and the forest. So their relocation is often on the premise of like protecting the forest. So that explains some of the external pressures for these community members. Now, in terms of the internal conflicts, since the forest management directly comes under the government protocol and the rules, so a lot of these community perspectives were never considered in the forest management policies or the discussions. So there's a lot of discussions and knowledge that these community members have, and because they've been living in this area for, I don't know when, for how long. So, but it's never been taken into mainstream for discussions and things like that. So it's a very centralized way of managing the forest. And there are some decentralization policies that has come up in 2006, but the implementation has suffered a lot in terms of bureaucracy and the paperwork, and, you know, yeah, it looks very good in the papers, those policies, but not in reality. So thank you. And Milind, if it's okay, I have a meeting at 1, which I really have to move into.
Thank you, Helina. Yes, I was about to say we're just at the right time here to move to our second speaker. Thank you very much, Helina.
Thank you, Helina. That was great.
Thank you so much, Terry. Thank you, Milind. And sorry, Ali, I would have loved to attend your talk. So sorry.
No worries. No worries. Thanks so much for sharing, Helina.
Thank you, everyone.
I'll hand it over to Terry Satterfield to introduce alley cutting.
Thanks, Milind, and really nice to see everybody, especially since I've been buried in my sabbatical hole. So, and there is a sort of, there's much in common with these talks, but I'm not sure it'll come out today, but a conversation to have in the future. But first of all, welcome to alley cutting, who is going to talk about her master's thesis work. She's just been a pleasure to work with. She's being supervised by myself and Rashid Samaya. And I just want to say she comes from a background in ecology, an undergraduate degree in ecology. She's also an Ocean Leaders Fellow here at UBC, and has had quite a bit of field experience, or came in the door, luckily, as it turns out, as you'll hear from her, came in the door with one field season behind her, unbeknownst to her was the pending pandemic, which I think turned, like so many of you, all of her plans completely upside down. And but she'll tell you about that now. And welcome, Allie. I'm just looking forward to this talk.
Thank you, Terry. Yeah, it's been a jumble of the last few years, but it's been many learnings. Not what it was expected to be learning, but good things still. Okay. Are you guys seeing this okay? Is it doing what?
So far, we just see you.
Oh, I didn't
see the slideshow yet.
Share screen button. That's an important one. Okay. How about now?
That looks good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, so hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. I'm going to be sharing about entangling assumptions, sea turtles, and paper parks in a Nicaraguan small-scale fishery. So, diving in here, in 2017, while in Nicaragua, I was fortunate to become friends with fishers and their families, as well as folks from a local NGO. In conversation, fishers expressed concerns regarding incidental catch of sea turtles and the regulations of a neighboring protected area. And in response, we came to collaborate and conduct the following study. So I come to this research as an invited outsider with a background in marine ecology. So zooming in on the Pacific coast of Nicaragua there, we come to the town of El Astillero, which translates to mean the shipyard. It's aptly named as the fishing is the primary economic activity, with 60% of households dependent on the industry. The fishery is small in scale as boats run via an outboard motor and measure 4 meters in length. 5 kilometers north lies Chacosente Beach, which is one of 9 mass nesting sites globally for the olive ridley sea turtle. So the olive ridley is considered a vulnerable species. It has an estimated 800,000 individuals globally, and it's a declining population. Females will lay 3 nests per year, and they'll use a mixed reproductive strategy. So sometimes they'll nest in a solitary, but most often they'll nest in masses, with sites receiving anywhere from 10,000 to a couple 100,000 nests per year. So that said, Chacosente is critical for the olive ridley population. Major threats to sea turtles include habitat loss at nesting sites and the harvest of eggs. Yet the most serious threat to turtles globally is bycatch. So bycatch is the unintentional capture of an individual in fishing gear. In the case of sea turtles, they can get ensnared in nets and then they're not able to surface and they subsequently will drown. So bycatch is also a stressor for fishers, as it lowers their fishing efficiency by having a turtle tangled in the net. It doesn't hang right or catch the fish that they're actually aiming for. It can also do damage to the fishing gear. So marine protected areas are a conservation strategy which restricts anthropogenic activities in oceanic environments as a means of providing protection and refuge for different species. There's currently a big push for marine protected areas, and as well as a lot of discussion around their effectiveness. So in 1975, sea turtles were included in CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And in response, in 1983, Nicaragua established the Chacosente Wildlife Refuge, with its #1 priority being the protection of sea turtles and sea turtle populations. So in this map, we can see the refuge boundaries there, which span both land and sea. But for the purpose of this study, we're just focusing in on the marine portion, which extends as just basically a rectangle straight off from the turtle nesting beach out 12 nautical miles, which takes it to the edge of the Nicaraguan territorial sea. So just a note for clarity, in this talk, marine protected areas is abbreviated as MPA. So given the implementation of the marine protected area and fishers' continued concern regarding sea turtle bycatch, we were led to ask the question, can the MPA be better tailored to meet the needs of both turtles and fishers? The challenge here is, by what evidence can this question be answered when there is no baseline data? Where there is some, albeit not much, data on Chacosente, most of it regards the nest numbers on shore, not activity at sea within the marine portion of the protected area. Additionally, bycatch data in small-scale fisheries is poor overall, including in this case. There's a lot of monitoring and data on large-scale industrial fishing fleets, and based on this, it's accepted that turtle bycatch is a really big problem. But in small-scale fishing fleets, data is deficient. They're really difficult to monitor because of limited resources, and the nature of the fishing strategies that are used in small-scale fisheries vary more widely. But regardless of this, the few studies that have been done on bycatch in small-scale fisheries, there is evidence that suggests small-scale fisheries might actually be responsible for as much, if not more, turtle mortality than large-scale fisheries. So there's a big data gap there that needs to be filled. Additionally, we need to work with our initial pilot data set. That's what we ended up working with for our analysis, as Terry alluded to. COVID threw a wrench in things. So just working with initial pilot data here. And the method we used to collect the data was known as an observer program, which necessarily used convenient sampling only. So as many observations as possible were collected, but this was always contingent on the captain's okay, which was then contingent on their motor operating, their gear being repaired, there being a fair price in the market, and fair weather conditions to go to sea. So given such, we ultimately decided that the best strategy to explore this question was to consider the MPA design as it did or did not affect fisher behavior in the ways expected. To do so, we looked at the marine protected area regulations on small scale fishing. And from there, we derived the underlying assumptions that seem to guide their design. So looking at the regulations, certain fishing activities are permitted, including hand lines and use of fishing rod with hook, while other fishing activities are not permitted, including setting traps and laying gill nets. These regulations are in place all year round, at least on paper. One thing our study looks at is, are these regulations actually being followed? And we'll get to that later. But the fishers of El Astillero were particularly interested in the gill net fishery. And furthermore, it was to their understanding that the regulations apply only in the turtle nesting season, which runs from June through November. So each of these interests and understandings then informed our study. All right, so the word gill net is going to come up a lot in the remaining slides. So to get us all just on the same page with this fish term, a gill net is a passive piece of fishing gear. So as you can see here, it's a net that sits on the bottom of the seafloor, and it creates a sort of wall in the water column. So sea creatures will swim into it, so they'll get snagged, often by the gill, hence the name, but any appendage can become entangled. So in El Astillero, net sets were typically 200 meters in length, and fishers would go to sea in the morning, drop their nets, leave them for 24 hours, and pick them up the following morning. So within the marine protected area regulations on the gill net fishing, there appear to be underlying assumptions, including the following. 1, if the marine protected area is created, then fishing near the beach will decline, and so too bycatch. 2, gill nets are a threat to turtles. If gill nets are banned, then our alternative gear will be used. 3, all gill nets are equally threatening. And 4, gill nets are equally threatening during all turtle nesting months, which run from June through November. So to explore these assumptions, we implemented an observer program in El Astillero. We trained 3 observers who would then go out to sea with the fishermen to collect data. And we worked with 46% of the gill net fishing fleet, which targeted 3 different species, including snapper, snook, and lobster. The program ran from June through November in 2019, again, which covers the span of the turtle nesting season. And in that time, 586 net sets were observed over 98 fishing trips. Captain participation in the program was voluntary, and I do want to note that fishing effort and subsequently our sample distribution varies between the different targeted species and months, and I will touch on this a bit more later. So that brings us to assumption 1. If MPA is created, then fishing near the beach will decline, and so too bycatch. We observed 586 fishing nets deployed, and of those, 42% occurred inside the marine protected area, while 58% occurred outside. And out of all of those fishing net sets, we observed 50 turtle bycatch events. And of those bycatch events, 54% occurred inside the MPA, and 46, sorry, did I say that right? Of those bycatch events, 54% occurred inside the MPA, while 46% occurred outside. So again, we do not have historic data to be able to claim if fishing near the nesting beach has declined with the creation of the MPA. But what we can say is that despite fewer fishing sets inside the MPA, relatively more bycatch is happening inside versus outside. This suggests that perhaps the boundary line is well placed, that it includes areas of high turtle density. So working to limit fishing inside the boundary might in fact decrease bycatch by a larger proportion. Here we can see, though, that the density of fishing activity. This is showing where net sets were deployed, with dark blue grids representing 1 net set and white grids representing areas where up to 5 net sets were deployed over the course of our whole sampling season. So while the marine protected area is in place on paper, the border does not appear to be minded in practice, which fits the definition of a paper park. To illustrate this a bit, in talking with fishers, there was a lack of clarity on where the actual border lies. So while this gap in information would account for some of the fishing activity in the MPA, I do not believe that it would account for the majority, as a large amount of fishing is occurring right off the nesting beach, seen in that northernmost cluster there of activity. That bright spot is pretty close to the nesting beach. And this is a spot where it's known that fishing is not permitted. So here we layer turtle bycatch events over fishing sets. And bycatch is represented with that red triangle there. 50 turtles were caught overall, and in some cases, multiple turtles were caught within the same net set. So what you see here is all net sets that incidentally caught 1 or more turtles. And while there is more risk of bycatch inside the MPA, bycatch outside the MPA is still really prevalent. So the bycatch problem will not be entirely solved by only focusing on activity within the MPA. So assumption 2 is that gill nets are a threat to turtles. If gill nets are banned, then alternative gear will be used. Again, unfortunately, we do not have baseline data to see how the use of gill nets has changed since creation of the MPA. But from our observations, roughly 50% of the fishing fleet primarily uses gill nets. This data was gathered based off of self-reports of fishers in 2019 and then again in 2021. And in that time, even as the overall fleet has increased from 60 boats to 82 boats, the proportion of gill nets remains consistent. So we believe gill net use remains high because they are the easiest point of entry to the fishery, and the use of alternative gear is really not always accessible for fishers. For example, nets do not require, like gill nets do not require any baits. They can be placed near shore at just a few hundred meters off of the beach, which saves cost on gas and on bait. In comparison, long line fishing, which is another method used in El Astillero, requires the purchase of bait for the hooks. And then these hooks are then placed further offshore at roughly 10 kilometers out to sea. So while long lining and other methods can be used in this area, the startup costs are greater than gill netting. And then with that as well, Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere based off of GDP, and El Astillero is well below the per capita income for the country. So again, alternative gear is not always an option. Assumption 3 is that all gill nets are equally threatening. So before diving in here, I just want to be clear that these 2 different pie charts are showing similar information. The left is raw observations and the right is normalized data. So gill net fishers will go out to sea with the aim to catch one of these 3 different species, including snapper, snook, and lobster. And they'll use slightly different strategies depending on what they're trying to catch. So just recalling for a moment, the marine protected area does not permit the use of any gill nets, no matter what species one is trying to catch. And looking at our observations, we find though that there is variation in the proportion of turtle bycatch based off of the species that's being targeted. So what the following numbers are really showing is that the percentage of turtle bycatch that occurs while fishing for each of these 3 species. And looking at the pie chart on the left, we see that out of all turtle bycatch events, snapper fishing caught 12% of the turtles, snook fishing caught 55%, and lobster caught 33%. Now, shifting to the pie chart on the right, again, this is normalized data. If you recall again, our sample of each target species our sample of each target species varies. So as not all species are equally sought after, the fishing effort for them changes. So to account for this, we normalized our turtle bycatch by the number of observed sets of each target species. So this shifts the proportion, with snapper accounting for 5% of turtle bycatch events, snook fishing accounting for 79%, and lobster accounting for 16%. In both cases, snook comes out badly, but the difference between lobster and snapper is not that great. I do want to quickly note the economic value of the species, keeping in mind how they contribute to the livelihoods of coastal communities. Of the targeted species, snapper makes up 40% of the total catch value. So almost half of the revenue made from gill netting comes from catching snapper, while snook makes up 15% of the value and lobster is 12% of the value. So it's interesting to note that snook produces the greatest proportion of bycatch and contributes relatively little to revenue.
5 minutes.
Okay. So variation of bycatch can likely be explained by the different strategies used to catch different species. Gill nets are made of mesh. The grid that makes up the net and the size of mesh a fisher will use varies depending on the body size of the species they're trying to catch. So there's a strong correlation between mesh size and species. Snook is a bigger fish, and bigger net mesh size are used to catch them, while snapper and lobster are both smaller and are both caught with similar mesh sizes. Additionally, fishing strategies vary based off of where the species are located and when they are in abundance, which brings us to seasons. So assumption 4, gill nets are equally threatening during all turtle nesting months, which span from June to November. Again, we have 2 different pie charts showing similar information. The left is raw observations, the right is normalized data. Looking at the pie chart on the left, we see that out of all turtle bycatch events, 42% of them occurred in September, while 40% occurred in July, and then less than 10% occurred in every other month. So now shifting to the pie chart on the right, again, to account for variation in our sample stemming from variation in fishing activity over time, we normalized our bycatch data by the number of observed sets in each month. So this shifts the proportion, with September accounting for 64% of bycatch events and July dropping down to account for 9% of bycatch, and October rising up to account for 15%. So bycatch is clearly much higher in some months than others. And to try to understand why, we consider the seasonality of both turtles nesting and fishing seasons. So yeah, recalling on the normalized data, non-normalized data had high bycatch in July and September. July can likely be explained as this is a peak snapper season, and it's a very active fishing month with lots of observations. Now, when we normalize the data, July bycatch drops down and October bycatch picks up, with September continuing to account for a large proportion. And this can likely be explained as August through October is the peak nesting season for the sea turtles. And furthermore, there's a lull in fishing activity in August as a dry spell comes through the region and the fishing isn't any good. And then another lull comes in October due to heavy rains and winds and the tropical storm season. So 2 of the 3 peak nesting months experience dips in fishing activity due to weather. So while our understanding of what is causing the variation month to month cannot be correlated, it is clear that not all seasons are equal and their nuance should be considered in order to optimize bycatch, or rather non-bycatch, and enable fishing as much as viably possible. So from our observation, the assumptions underlying the current MPA regulations do not seem to hold. It was assumed that with an MPA, fishing and bycatch near the nesting site will decline. We found that boundaries are poorly minded by fishers and that relatively more bycatch is happening inside the MPA. It was then assumed that if gill nets are banned, alternative gear will be used, while in reality, gill nets still make up half of the fishing fleet and are widely used. And then it was assumed that all gill nets are equally threatening. We found gill nets that fish for snook to account for a high proportion of bycatch, and believe that snook fishing should be studied further for bycatch with regard to the use of a different mesh size. And finally, it was assumed that gill nets are equally threatening during all turtle nesting months, but observations suggest September specifically should be studied further given its high proportion of bycatch, yet its lack of being a peak fishing season. So as such, interventions in this month could be an effective time to address turtle bycatch while having minimal negative effects on fisher livelihoods. So from these observations, there are some low-hanging fruits for recommendations. Information on protected area boundaries could be better communicated with demarcation at sea, or the boundaries could be redrawn to align with natural attributes. As highlighted here, this is the municipal border that is already established, and it follows a river, which is a very well-known boundary within the community. If conservation approaches want alternative gear to be used, then there needs to be some forms of support in place for fishers to adopt the alternative. Additionally, rather than fully switching gear types and getting rid of gill nets altogether, gear can be modified. There have been a few studies now showing that when LED lights are added to gill nets, turtle bycatch can go down by 60%, while fish catch remaining unchanged, which is pretty promising. Closures can also be tailored to be more species specific. In this case, closing the snook gillnet fishery could address the largest proportion of turtle bycatch, yet still allowing the snapper gillnet fishery to remain open would enable fishers to still have access to valuable catch, which is important for their livelihood security. And lastly, seasonal closures could be put in place when turtle nesting is high. There's relatively less gill netting during months from August to November anyway, so abiding by a seasonal closure may be more economically viable for fishers than a sweeping all year closure. So turtle bycatch is a problem that both of the key stakeholders in this area, being both conservationists and fishers, want to solve. There is willingness and interest in addressing it, and that in and of itself is exciting and another low-hanging fruit. Our study really gets at raising more questions and highlighting areas of nuance that should be considered in the design of the Chacosente MPA, especially when seeking to effectively meet the needs of both turtles and fishers, as both of them know this marine environment as home. So I just want to give a big thank you specifically to the fishers and their families of El Astillero, my collaborator Casa Congo, and especially to Rashid and Terry as my co-supervisors, and my lab mates in the respective labs. Everything's been hugely helpful in this process. So thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. It was great. And it looks like we might even have a few minutes for questions. Melinda, or should we just see which hands come up? I see on my screen Tim and Sarah, but I'm not sure what else is visible.
That's what I'm seeing too. Oh, now I'm just seeing Sarah.
Now
Sarah?
just Sarah.
You might want to stop sharing, Ellie.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Sarah.
Hi. First, I just want to start by saying what an amazing presentation. You presented that so clearly, and I love that you used best available information to so clearly look at a policy question. And I'm just super jazzed about what you just presented to everyone. I could just see that happening in a policy arena and everybody would get it and it would make sense. And that's amazing. So well done. My question for you is around the snook. I'm just wondering, it's interesting that they fish so much snook, but yet it's not, you know, it's worth quite a lot less to their pocketbooks. So what role does snook play in food security? Because often what we see is the valuable species they sell for consumption, but then sometimes the less valuable species have non-monetary value, such as food security. And so have you looked at that? And is it possible that could put a little wrench in the idea of, you know, snook is the thing to look at?
Totally. Yeah. Thank you for your question, Sarah. And thank you as well for, yeah, just your reflections on and thoughts on the presentation. It's always really helpful to hear. Yeah, food security. That's a question I would love to dig into more. That hasn't been possible in the scope, but it's definitely something that is of interest in really exploring. And yeah, I think within the fishery, and I didn't include this in the breakdown, but there were 30 gillnet fishers. 7 of them were snook fishers. So a small proportion of the gillnet fishery in general. And it did seem that usually people who had fished with snook also had other gear types that they sometimes use. So it didn't seem to be a staple piece of equipment. It seemed more like a secondary one. And in that case, yeah, I think there could be room to explore that it might, yeah, on the food security side. So yeah, great question though, thank you.
Other questions?
Hey, so great to see you again and fantastic presentation. So how much of your work was actually done in person over there and how much was done remotely? And then second of all, what do you think is the feasibility of a seasonal closure as you described? Like, do you think this is actually something that can be done?
Yeah, good to see you, Narayan.
Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. In terms of the data collection, so myself and my research partner, Luca, come with a local research partner named Manuel. We were gathered in May and prepped the training for the observers. So prepped all the materials, trained them up, did a couple weeks of practice observing, and then we were there with the observers running the program from June to August. I then left, and the program continued running on the ground from September, October, November. So I was half there for the field season, and then it kept running on its own. And yeah, regarding your question on the feasibility, I think there definitely is interest to make changes. I think, the fact that both like conservationists and fishers are seeing this as a problem, I think makes it more feasible. I think the difficulty and the marine protected area and the management of it has noted that they're wanting to move to things regarding co-management. But I think it's a lack of capacity to get there. So yeah, I think the want is there, but action hasn't been taken to do so yet. Does that get at your question, Ryan?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And so did you make it out to Nicaragua again this year, or was that all in 2019?
No, it was all 2019. Yeah, and we were hoping to run a survey as well. That got stymied due to more political issues this last year. But hopes to get back this year to disseminate results and see what fishers are interested in continuing with.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Ellie, can you just speak a little bit to your September findings and how do you think, it was so surprising to see such a small number of net sets and such a large number of bycatch in that month. Do you think that's just a wild anomaly, or do you think that really is a better definition of the peak season? What do you think is going on there?
Right, I don't have, we need more data. But I think there definitely is more snook fishing going on within September. So it could be attributed to that, and kind of like that cross section of high nesting season and high snook, if snook is already, having a high proportion of the bycatch. And
but it's kind of medium season for snook, isn't it?
It's not peak, it's medium. You're right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't know. More thinking is needed there, definitely. Mm-hmm. I think there. Yeah, because I think you have a drop in. Well, I don't know. It seems like the two might be compounding, snook and September in some sense, because when you have that drop in fishing activity in August, fishers, you have a drop in gill netting, but then fishers will sometimes switch, the ones that can, to something like long lining. So it might just be too that you're having a whole shift from high gill nets in general to other forms. And then September might just be the fact that you have still small gill net fishing happening, but it's just that influence of turtle density that just is really driving the gear interaction crazy. I'm not sure.
Okay, no, that's interesting. It's hard not to be interesting to compare that month to the nesting data that is there. And thought of that till today. Yeah. I think we're out of time, Anna is saying. But
thank you, everyone.
Anna, did you want to raise your comment or just have that as a departing signature?
That's fine. Someday I'll ask you, Allie, if you have any like speculative thoughts about any differences between people who allowed observation and those who did not, like just from your conversations with people and all that.
Totally. Yes. But, okay, we'll continue.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Good to
thank
see
you.
everybody. Thanks for the nice turnout. I will see you next time.